Welcome back. You're watching The Front Row. We're looking at the ties that bind, bilateral ties between Kenya and Tanzania in light of the visit by Tanzania's President Samia Suluhu Hassan, who joined President Uhuru Kenyatta, who's hosting her today. She's here on a two-day state visit, expected to address the Kenyan Parliament tomorrow at about 2:30 p.m. A number of agreements have already been made owing to that meeting in State House earlier today. But I want us now to talk about COVID-19. Let's shift our gears a bit. COVID-19 brought, the politics around it, brought a lot of bad blood between these two countries. And looking at President Suluhu Hassan, there seems to be a major shift in the handling of this pandemic. I'll start with you, Nicodemus. How are you looking at this? President Suluhu now donning masks. We are seeing an attempt at, trying to combat the virus as opposed to what we saw previously. How will that work out for TZ?
I think President Samia Suluhu Hassan's approach to the corona pandemic in Tanzania is quite strategic in a number of ways. First of all, she inherits a government that had actually denied the presence of corona in the country for over a year. We understand the policy that the late president had taken, and of course now she succeeds. She succeeds President Magufuli, but she has to tread a very careful path in terms of her approach, in terms of coming up with policies. And you have seen her approach has been very procedural. It has been very well calculated in the sense that, of course, it has a number of economic implications. Does the country go to a lockdown? Of course, in the immediate, one of our policies that she put is by having this committee of experts in which they wanted now to, she has tasked them to come up with proper recommendations on how to guide the government to approach it. But of course, yesterday we saw other principles that have been laid out by the Ministry of Health and guidelines, which are intended to curb the spread of coronavirus through the borders and incoming visitors, and as well as the Tanzania nationals that are arriving back to the country. So for me, my reading of the whole situation for President Samia Suluhu Hassan is the fact that she has taken this very procedurally, very strategic, in the sense that, of course, there are still other, back home, we have COVID hardliners who are still aligned to the previous regime, and so on and so forth. So she has to tread a very careful balance in terms of moving forward and setting up measures, the measures that are very unique to Tanzania, and I think she has done well so far.
One of the agreements that they reached, both presidents reached today, was on health ministers have been directed to craft a framework for speedy COVID-19 checks at the borders to avoid the crossing delays. And this is a problem that has been there consistently since last year when the COVID-19 hit both countries. What then, Dr. Keegan, should we expect, particularly at the border points, in light of this new agreement?
Well, the agreement actually is a movement towards synchronizing, the policies between the two countries. And we see that one of the issues that they're trying to deal with is the free movement of people and goods. And I think this has been one of the key impediments of trade between the two countries. So one of the things they're trying to iron out, because the COVID-19 situation actually brought divides in the region, which shouldn't have been the case. So we probably are going to see increased trade between the two countries, since we'll have now synchronized policies between the two. In the past, we've had different policies, and therefore we've had problems at the border points, etc. So we're going to see a little bit of free movement of persons and goods. And of course, this will have a positive ripple effect on the trade between the two countries. We're looking at the tourism industry, which has been heavily hit by the COVID-19 pandemic. We're going to see some positive trends towards that. And of course, the airline industry itself, which has been hurting, we're going to see probably a lot more cooperation between that once you have the policies in place through cooperation. And of course, the global health diplomacy in the region will see positive outcomes. So I think we're going to see better outcomes in terms of trade, tourism, and cooperation even in the airline and the movement of persons and goods in the region.
What will be the trickle-down effect of all this to the people, the most important in this group, in this conversation?
Yes, when you're looking at the people themselves, one of the things is that we have border communities and we have people who actually engage in trade across the borders. And this was disrupted once we had disagreements in terms of different policies on how to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, once you have the free movement of person and goods, so at the people-to-people level, at the community level, then you have the border communities being able to actually the governments have facilitated their free movements there. And once you see the trade between the two countries, the border communities actually trading amongst each other, then of course the livelihoods will go up. Not forgetting, the tourism industry, of course, which many people also rely on for their livelihood. So I think when we look at it more so at the person level, when we look at the border communities, I think they have a lot to gain in this, as well as the industries that I've just mentioned.
Nicodemus, we're about to wind up, but I really want us to talk about the East African community integration. This has been touched on today. One of the issues has been contribution to, the EAC. And I had President Uhuru Kenyatta say that they will ensure that perhaps there's regular contribution by member states. But these constant spats between Kenya and Tanzania, how have they affected the larger EAC integration? And now that we're seeing them gravitate towards each other, what do we expect for the larger EAC countries or bloc?
Well, that's a very good question, especially in the sense that, the previous speakers have spoken about issues to do with dominance, issues to do with competition. And when you see these frictions that oftentimes occasion two countries, neighboring countries, it shows you that there is some sort of sense of growing competition and sense of trying to see who is the hegemon of the region. And Tanzania, rightly so, wants to claim that position because of its growth in terms of economics and so on and so forth. But regarding to the East African community, the cooperation of Tanzania and Kenya is of vital importance, as your guest Kwame mentioned earlier on. It is very important that these two countries show commitment. Why? Because they are the leading countries in terms of population, in terms of economic, in terms of, they are the founding members of this East African community thing and so on and so forth. And we saw there's some sort of intransigency that comes to, that Tanzania has often terms showed. And if you can recall, 2013, the coalition of the willing, where Tanzania, outrightly secluded itself together with Burundi. But there is also the larger question of harmonizing deals, harmonizing trade agreements and so forth, which Tanzania, to a larger degree, has been a bit hesitant. And this is a result of historical mistrust, competition. But of course, for me, as an expert in international relations, I see this as the growing influence of Tanzania. And when a country tries to start to, to flex its economic powers, of course, it ruffles some feathers. And of course, it comes with this, infighting between Kenya and Tanzania, which is like an afterthought, an aftermath of the growth of maybe one country at the expense of another.
So then, looking at the disagreements from the word go, starting with the development model, socialism or capitalism that Kenya adopted pretty much, not fully, but pretty much largely. Did we ever overcome this? And if not, would we get there? And that's really a question to both of you.
Ideological differences have existed between these two countries, of course. Now Tanzania has already transitioned to a fully capitalist economy, but of course the legacies of socialism are still present in terms of how people do their business, in terms of how they approach general life and so on and so forth, which is maybe a total contrast to our Kenyan counterparts, which who are more capitalistic in nature, very competitive in nature. And this has an effect in terms of how people relate, in terms of how people do business. But again, this notwithstanding, there is need for further to look beyond these ideological differences and forge a united front, especially under the auspices of the East African Community and the treaty that calls for deeper integration, widening of trade, and of course, starting with customs union and the implementations of common markets, and of course, a monetary union, if that will ever be achieved, and of course, ultimately a political federation, which is an ideal situation. So I think there are many opportunities to come in the future.
Dr. Keegan, the ideologies, the difference in ideologies from the word go.
As we look at the ideologies, we're seeing probably at the political front, traditionally there have been differing ideologies. But when we look at these two countries, we need to look beyond the political ideologies per se, to look at probably the points of convergence. If you look at Tanzania and Kenya, they have a lot more in common than the differences. And as we look at the ideology, there are many other factors of ideology that the two share. I mentioned the border community issues. We're looking at the language, the cultural, and I think one of the areas that we're looking at is, for example, the cultural diplomacy per se. So I wouldn't probably see the difference in ideology as being a stumbling block with regard to cooperation between these two countries. I think the last speaker has talked about, for example, some of the strategic competition that we might see in the region. However, if we look beyond that, we can see that there are actually opportunities for cooperation between the two. And through this cooperation, probably we'll see much gain for both countries as a whole, as opposed to that. So as much as there might be some limited ideological differences in terms of the historical, political aspect of it, I do not see that trickling into today's political stance and landscape. I think the times have already transcended that, and we have moved towards now embracing the capitalist model and trying to see how especially free trade can be achieved. So I see more commonalities today than the differences that were there in terms of ideology in the past.
Mm-hmm. I'm imagining this would aid in the next step that this relationship that would take?
Absolutely. I think it will really aid in the next step, especially one of the key areas to look at, and this was mentioned by the last speaker, is the East Africa community. As we saw, the past difference between Kenya and Tanzania actually led to the near collapse of the EAC. But now with the two countries coming together, and we're seeing also Tanzania and Uganda solidifying their ties, which have historically been good. I think one of the key focal points should be the East Africa community, because when we look at other regions of the world, bilateral competition takes the forefront. But when you look at the international relations of African states, we might have some competition, but predominantly the identity and reciprocity principle would come out and dominate the relations between the two countries. So I think at the regional level, EAC will benefit greatly with this new cooperation between the two countries.
Nicodemus, that President Uhuru Kenyatta just a few weeks ago sent one of the CSs, Amina Mohamed, to formally invite President Suluhu to Kenya. That President Uhuru Kenyatta was seen as the first one to reach out to President Suluhu. Was he really anticipating for a new chapter? Does that speak to that?
Well, most definitely, in terms of diplomacy, you make moves. And I think, for me, I read it in a number of ways. One is the fact that President Kenyatta actually underscores, and he understands that Tanzania is of strategic interest to Kenya in terms of trade relations and so on and so forth. And of course, he was also consoling Mama Samia, who we are bereaved that the passing of President Magufuli. So the first move was largely symbolic in the sense that it's a leaf of an open chapter. Can we trade? Can we engage more? Especially in the past year or so, things have been very, very frosty with the banning of chicks, the near closure of the border because of COVID, of course, with the banning of the flights and so on and so forth. So it has been very, very stuck in the past year or so. So this was an opportunity for almost a restart or a rekindling of this relationship that if it was actually nurtured very well, then it can be one of the best, if you ask me.
Mm-hmm. Let me read just about 2 tweets as we wind up here. I'm seeing Morgan, who says, also recall to notify Tanzania president that taxation, corruption of doing business in Kenya is too high, most of them, and cannot sustain us. Maybe concerns on the ease of doing business on our side. Tomkin Baraza says, Samia Suluhu understands well international diplomacy compared to her predecessor. I hope from now onwards we shall have strong bilateral ties with Tanzania, which will boost our economy. And we have Bernard Arap Kirui, who says, I think this is the right direction for the two countries are heading. I'd really like to end it at that point. Thank you very much for joining us and engaging with us here on the front row. Our guest, Dr. Kigan Marumbasi, is the chairperson of the International Relations Society of Kenya, and Nicodemus Minde is a foreign policy expert. Earlier on, I had a conversation with Kwame Owino, the CEO of the Institute for Economic Affairs, and we're also expected to be joined by Peter Mathuki, who's the Secretary General of the East African Community, but unfortunately, he's not been able to join us on the program. Thank you for joining us. Remember, tomorrow, day 2 of President Samia Suluhu Hassan, and she will be addressing the bicameral House, that's the Senate and the National Assembly. In the afternoon, we'll be bringing you all the details live here. I am Akisa Wandera. Till next time.